Hello all. My name is Michelle Charters. I'm the head of International Slavery Museum, but tonight I'm here in my role as the co-director of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. I just wanted to open this event for you and to say thank you very much for coming out in this weather. It did start off nice and sunny today, but we've lost it already. But this is a really important event, and it's a very important event for us because this year marks 20 years of research excellence led by the Centre for the Study of International Slavery. It's been a unique and thriving partnership between the University of Liverpool and International Slavery Museum. And to mark this milestone, we are hosting a series of programs, workshops and consultations as we celebrate and critically reflect on the past 2 decades to help inform the next. We thank you all for being part of this ongoing conversation. And tonight, we're really thrilled to celebrate International Women's Day by featuring the latest publication from our illustrious Dr. Miranda Kaufmann, Heiresses, Marriage, Inheritance and Caribbean Slavery. Dr. Kaufmann is joined in a conversation by National Museums Liverpool International Slavery Museum own Nasra Elliot as we explore the impact of women in history. We also celebrate the brilliance and achievements of female professionals today. So please join me in welcoming them both. So the biography introductions, I know Dr. Miranda and Nasra don't need much introduction, but I think that they deserve one today and for us to recognise their brilliance. Dr. Miranda Kaufmann is the author of Black Tudors, The Untold Story, which was shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize and the Nayaf al-Rodham Prize and has sold over 50,000 copies. She is a senior research fellow at the University of London's Institute of Commonwealth Studies, an honorary fellow of the University of Liverpool, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and of the Royal Society of Arts, and she has written for The Times, The Guardian, TLS and BBC History magazine. Miranda lives in North Wales. She will be donating her profits from the book to reparative causes. And now we'll go on to Nasra. Nasra Elliot is an independent researcher and works at International Slavery Museum. Her research explores the histories and legacies of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, recently focusing on the Crew people of Liberia and the enduring impacts of these systems. She has investigated the roles of Liverpool-based women who are active as slave traders, investors, and plantation owners, revealing overlooked connections between gender, wealth, and slavery. Nasra is passionate about uncovering hidden histories and encourages public conversations about memory, heritage, and the ongoing legacies of slavery. So I'm now going to sit down and enjoy this fabulous night with both of you. So thank you, everybody.
So I'll go straight into the conversation, Miranda. First and foremost, I've been lucky enough to read the book, and it's an extremely rich and well-written book. But what stood out for me is the fact that you brought themes up such as marriage, inheritance, gender, and enslavement all at once, which we don't often see. So I suppose my first question to you would be, what made you pick these particular heiresses, the 9 that you chose, and also why did you think this was an important story to tell?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think I've got some slides. Are these going to work? Does this... Sorry, I knew I should have checked this before. Is that going to... Well, I was going to start by saying that I think one of the important things for me was to focus on women, because I think when we think of enslavers, we usually think of men. Is that working? Not working. Do you have a button? I've only got a couple. Can you press it again? Yes. And these are some of the men that are probably more famous as enslavers, including your friend Gladstone there. So Gladstone being your Liverpool, one of the leading Liverpool enslavers, and going all the way back to John Hawkins, who I encountered in the Black Tudors book, and a Welshman. I've chucked a Welshman in there, Henry Morgan, who you might know better from the rum, was actually owned a plantation in Jamaica that the heiress in chapter 9 ends up inheriting sort of 200 years later. But can you press it? But I think we don't think of the women, and these are the 9 women that are featured in the book. And I sort of first came up against the idea of heiresses back in 2006 when I was doing a research project for English Heritage, looking at their houses and finding out if they had links to enslavement. And my mentor, Madge Dresser, sort of said, well, there are lots of different things you should be looking at, but one of them, which can be relatively hidden, is if the man of the house married an heiress, and the wealth came in that way, sort of under cover of matrimony. And sometimes that's quite hidden. So, let's say it's Smith Hall and it's been home to the Smith family for 5 generations, but there aren't any Smiths in the database of enslavers or anything like that. But then you learn that John Smith III married Miss Jones of Jamaica. You then see that, and so my first heiress was actually the one with the dog, who was a gift from one of her lovers. Later at that point, Lady Webster of Battle Abbey, and her husband lived at Battle Abbey, which is an English heritage property that was actually built on the site of the Battle of Hastings. And so I learnt about her when I was doing that survey, and then I wanted to find out more. And by the time I got round to the book, the UCL Legacies of British Slavery database had been published, and that made it a lot easier to sort of survey the archives for these kinds of stories. And I found over 150 women who sort of fulfilled my criteria of inheriting a significant amount of wealth from plantation enslavement, marrying in Britain, and these kind of stories, but actually, so therefore bringing the wealth to Britain, not sort of still living in the Caribbean. But actually it was then quite easy to narrow it down, because it didn't seem to be a depth of archival material on quite a lot of these women, and so I focused in on the ones that there was the beefiest sort of archive behind to sort of dig into, and also had the most sort of dramatic and crazy stories with sort of personal drama, but also links to much bigger stories like the American Revolution or Napoleon or Marie Antoinette. One of them was the one with the feathery hat, was actually living in Paris and Versailles, and when the French Revolution broke out, she was sort of, was in a carriage going across Paris on the day that they stormed the Bastille.
So there's some incredible stories in there and lots of scandal. What stood out for me again with how you wrote the book is the fact that you humanised the enslaved people so much. Mm. Were there any particular enslaved people who stood out for you?
So I thought it could easily have just been a kind of drawing room drama, but I thought it was really, really important to dig down into the plantation records and find the stories of the enslaved people whose labour made these women's lavish lifestyles possible. And I suppose that's the sort of attitude I sort of brought forward from Black Tudors as well, of like that sometimes people assume that there is nothing to be found about people who were not upper class white men, but actually if you ask the right questions and you keep digging, then sometimes these stories do emerge. And I think the one that stood out enough that I started chapter 1 with it, I thought I'll read you this sort of first paragraph of chapter 1 to sort of bring it to life, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great.
So in January 1795, an enslaved woman named Betsy Newton made a desperate journey from Barbados to London. The overseer at Newton Plantation had executed her brother. She'd been clapped in irons and sent to work in the field. Without her care, her newborn baby boy had died. She had appealed for help from the plantation attorney, but his wife turned her away from their home, taunting, "Your mistress will give you all away to strangers." Loath to leave her other 4 young children behind, Betsy nevertheless decided she must appeal directly to her enslaver for all their sakes. If she returned home, the overseer would certainly kill her. Come hell or high water, she must sail for England. She knew that Lady Sarah Holt, no Newton, that one, up top left. She knew that Sarah, one of 2 sisters who had enslaved her and her family for the last decade, had recently died. The other, Elizabeth Newton, lay seriously ill. As neither sister had any children, no one knew who was going to inherit Betsy and her family. She must reach England before the will was finalised. The only way she could be reunited with her children would be to return to Barbados carrying a certificate of her freedom and an order for her children to be released. Surely this was only right. 27 years earlier, an English court of law had ruled that her grandmother, Mary Heiresses, née Revel, was a free woman. But the Newton family had defied the judge's order to return Mary to England. Betsy, however, refused to be ignored. She would confront her enslaver face to face. And, I thought that was just, I think it's a great, Betsy's story is brilliant in itself, that she has such courage and, and has such this, it has the agency to be able to get herself from Barbados to London. But it's also, I think, important because it kind of it pierces sort of assumptions that people make about the lives of enslaved people, particularly perhaps enslaved women, and it can't. Then you have to start asking new questions and start thinking harder about how you imagine that history to have really played out.
Yeah, it is astounding, Betsy's story. Someone that stood out for me in terms of the Heiresses was in chapter 2, I believe, Frances Dalzell. She stood out for me because she was mixed heritage. Her grandmother was of African descent.
It's the one in the green dress.
The one in the green dress, yeah. So she stood out for me. Obviously, her phenotype is more towards her European ancestry, but do you think she had any affinity at all towards her African relatives, enslaved people, or was it simply business as usual?
Well, there certainly isn't any evidence that I've seen that shows any kind of sympathy, and I think one of the more sort of brutal things in the archive is a sort of a letter she sends to her attorney in Jamaica. She inherits from her father, and before she gets married, she sort of really is in charge of business. She's inherited jointly with her younger brother, but he's only about 12 or something, so she's really in charge. And she writes to him saying, she actually says sort of, she's got a shopping list, and on the list it says, buy more enslaved Africans, except that isn't the word she uses. And it's like next to, it's sort of next to, candlesticks and writing paper and herrings, and then so he asked her to purchase new Negroes in the name of my brother and me, and to have our mark, and that means she wants them to all be branded with the family brand, so that if they try and run away, they can be returned as property. So I mean, I think that one line really kind of sums up what we know about her attitude to enslaved people. But so it's her mother. Her mother was born enslaved, but was the daughter of a French Huguenot merchant in Kingston, Jamaica. And we don't actually know Frances's grandmother's name at all, but she would have been an enslaved African. And so Susanna, Frances's mother, is born enslaved, but gains her freedom as a young woman, and then has a relationship with Frances's father. And so she actually inherits a lot of property from the first man to abuse her, and it clearly was a very abusive relationship because he was sort of 40 years older than her or something, and began when she was a teenager. So there's a book called Dispossessed Lives, and I can't remember the name of the author right now. But you know, scholars have identified, you know, the impossible choices that women of mixed heritage and women of colour had to make to survive in that society where every gradation of skin colour dictated your fate.
Yeah, of course. In terms of accountability, memory and reparations, how does the dynamics of women, how does that change the story in people's perceptions, do you think? About, you know, accountability.
I suppose it's important to realise that, yeah, the women were just as culpable as the men in this story. A man who was interviewing me was like, it's not really a feminist book, is it? And I'm like, no, it really is. You know, because I think he had this vision of feminism that it had to be positive, you know, we had to be celebrating women. And, well, you know, there's not much to celebrate about these women. So, you know, no, but I was like, no, I'm arguing for their equal right to be judged culpable, their equal right to be, you know, to be villains in the story. So it is a feminist book, but yeah. So I think and I think the other, did anyone press the button to the next slide? Because I think that through these women's stories, it kind of broadens the sweep of how interconnected our whole society, our whole history is with this history. I mentioned the Battle of Hastings earlier, and you know that's a connection people don't think of, but. You know, through these Heiresses stories, I found connections to all of these sort of key places and figures in British history. That's the Davy mining lamp, and Humphrey Davy, who invented it, only had the freedom to pursue his scientific research because he married an heiress from Antigua. Nelson married a girl from Nevis when he was still a sailor in the Caribbean. As a young man, but he didn't get as much money out of her as he was hoping. There's the letter where he's sort of complaining to I think his wife or a friend saying, oh, yeah, I'm really not getting, you know, the money, and they're being very slow paying it as well. He got sort of a fraction of what he there's the earlier letters where he writes home going, oh yeah, when I marry Fanny, I'm going to get rich, and yeah, no, it doesn't work out that way. You know, Jane Austen's aunt is one of the women in the book, chapter 4. It's all about Jane Austen's aunt. Oh, that's nice. A good response. A gasp from the audience there. That's what we like. Yeah, so, and that's, you know, I think that's a part of Austen's work that, you know, there's more to it than that. And people have begun to explore sort of race and enslavement, I suppose, particularly through the novel Mansfield Park. But I think there's a lot more digging you could do into Jane's social circle and who she knew. I mean, I found this one party she went to where she was wearing a dress borrowed from her Barbados-born aunt, and she danced with 2 different enslavers that night at the ball. So I think it's important to know that context when we're looking at her work. And what have I got there? The British Museum was the founding collection of the British Museum belonged to Sir Hans Sloane, who Sloane Square is named after. But again, he married a wealthy Jamaican heiress, and that helped finance his collections. And Windsor Castle has got furniture and statuary in it that George IV developed these huge state apartments in the 1820s, and these huge rooms, and he didn't have enough furniture to fill them with that was sort of grand enough. And luckily for him, the enslaver family in chapter 9 of the book had spent all their money in an insane shopping spree, having inherited from the wealthiest enslaver in Jamaica. They still managed to spend it all. And so they were auctioning off all their art and furniture, and George IV bought it with taxpayers' money, but at a very discount price, he told the Prime Minister, because they were desperate. They were selling everything off. They were selling off their bedclothes and pots and pans while they were at it. But yeah, so it's all kind of interconnected, and I think that was part of the wider story I wanted to tell, like through these individual stories, because I think people connect better with other people, and I think these women stories are fascinating in their own right. But I think you go in that, and I'm just looking at 9 families and the network, the web of these connections. So I think that hopefully someone will read this and they'll get a deeper understanding of how you know, how deeply interconnected our society and our history is to this horrible crime.
Yeah, so marriage was basically for finance. That come through as a theme strongly throughout the whole book, and it was so interesting to see that there was I can't recall the name of it, but it was a directory done by a gentleman, and it was basically
Not
a
a very
directory of assets and wealth of heiresses. So he was giving the gentleman, you know, look at, she's got, you know, this estate, or she is worth this amount of money, and, you know, check out all these heiresses via a directory. I found that absolutely
An exact alphabetical list
Yes.
of the duchesses, marchionesses, countesses, ladies, etc., with an account of their places of abode, reputed fortunes, and fortunes they possess in the stocks. And usually the stocks were in the East India Company or the South Sea Company, which were, you know, pretty, you know, all tied into the South Sea Company. Also traded enslaved Africans. So it's all sort of interconnected. But importantly, it's written by a younger brother, and, you know, the nature of the sort of British aristocracy and gentry was that the oldest son inherited everything. So younger brothers, you know, had to look at, it was good to look out for an heiress. But I think the British upper classes have, you know, the Caribbean source of the wealth is a sort of new thing, but the marrying an heiress was always an appealing prospect. Marriage was always looked at as sort of dynastic, or, you know, marrying somebody from the right sort of family or with money was always, you know, we haven't left this. You know, there's a new book out called Inheritocracy, which very much, you know, people are a bit more subtle about it now. But what's that TikTok song? So I'm looking for a man in finance, blue eyes, 6'5". You know, like it's not over. You know, marrying for money is, I'm sure, still alive and well. We're just a bit more subtle about it.
Definitely. What I'd like to ask as well, just move on a little bit, is in terms of distance, so geographical distance and also emotional and moral distance. Do you think that the heiresses in the Caribbean were much different to the heiresses who were in Britain, who never set foot on a plantation in the colonies, who never actually seen what was happening over in their plantations?
Well, I think about several of the women that I wrote about were born in the Caribbean and spent, you know, maybe like the first sort of 5 or 6 up to 10 years of their lives in the Caribbean before moving to England. Being sent to England for education was the way they put it sometimes, or sometimes the whole family would move back. One of them, Mary Ramsey, lived in Kingston, Jamaica till she was 20, but the rest of them kind of came here as children. So they did, you know, they would have had that kind of that experience. But I think even the ones that were never who never went to the Caribbean can't really be absolved. You know, I think that especially when you look at the presence of black people in Britain and formerly enslaved or people with sort of a murky legal status working in these households as well. So they might well have spent time with they might have been waited on by people from the Caribbean, even if they had, you know, had left there as children or hadn't been there. And I think you know, certainly once the abolitionist sort of campaign in the later part of the 18th century gets going, like there's no excuse for not knowing what's going on. Like it is being talked about and discussed, you know, and people know about it. I mean, there's actually, yeah, Sarah Newton, John Newton, her brother John Newton. There's a source where, you know, it's in the gossip in the local area that they're in Lichfield, I think, and they're saying, oh, that they know that they have a neighbour and they know this story about what happened on his plantation, or at least their version of it, that he'd been attacked and lost his hand or something in some kind of uprising. So like people knew about it, and if they knew other people who had been there, they had family members who'd been there, and, you know, so I don't think they have any excuse for pretending they had no idea what was going on. And certainly their letters with their attorneys in the Caribbean show, you know, once they're sort of involved in managing the estates, it's quite clear that they, you know, like that shopping list, they know what's going on.
Yeah. Another thing that I was thinking about during reading the book is how much were they constrained as women? Was there any tensions with the fact that they were women in receiving their inheritance themselves, and was there any legal battles that they had to take on in order to possess their plantations?
Yeah, it was quite tricky. It could be tricky, that it's so. It's quite interesting. Some of the wills that they're left the money in from fathers or grandfathers or uncles. They quite often have this sort of phrase, beyond her husband's control, but they don't leave the money to them directly. They put it in a trust for them, and that sort of sidesteps the legal principle of coverture. So in this society, when you got married, your husband automatically kind of got all your wealth. But if your wealth was in a trust, then it wasn't yours. So they could kind of sidestep that. But then the trust is being managed by the trustees, who are a bunch of men. So you still don't have complete control over your assets. But they really were as active as they could be. So Frances DL manages to fight the trustees and get the administration of her father's will, for example, because she has to manage his debts more than his assets, really, at that point. But so they still have to negotiate with these men. And I mean, in one case, all the trustees die, within a couple of years of each other. So she can't get the money because they're all dead, and they all have kind of heirs, and that ends up in court, and it's a complete mess. But so it's complicated. It's not, and I think. Obviously, there are women who, before they get married and after their husbands die, they have more control than when the husbands are. But even if the husbands are kind of writing the letters or sort of pursuing the court cases or whatever, I think my feeling is that the women would have been quite involved, sort of behind the scenes anyway, because especially if they're the ones where it was their family that the wealth came from, that they're the ones with the knowledge of the Caribbean. So I think they were sort of very much involved.
Okay, and how did the Heiresses' deaths affect the enslaved people?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that was really interesting about Betsy Newton's story, is the thing that sort of precipitates her flight from Barbados is that she finds out that her enslaver's dead. And there's these two sisters, and the second one is old and ill, and neither of them have got any children. So when the plantation attorney's wife says, they're going to give you all away to strangers, she's not kidding. Like that, they don't know who they're going to be left to, because there's a range of different kind of distant cousins who are in the lineup, and some of the ones that don't get it get quite cross with the ones who do get it, because they were sort of more distantly related. And but this is a serious issue that campaigners to end enslavement sort of highlight, that if your property, your life is dictated by the whims of your enslavers and sometimes their lifespan, and you could be sold off to pay someone's debts or sort of parceled off when somebody died. So I found that link between the mortality of the heiresses in Britain and the kind of life trajectories of the people they enslaved. There's this really intimate sort of interrelationship between them, and it sort of pushes both ways as well. So one of the women, I don't know if we can go back to the slide with the women on them. The one in black and the baby, the little girl with the lamb. She when she inherited from her father, when her father died, he didn't leave a will, and it turned out he was in massive debt rather than not. So actually, the sort of when the fortunes were bad, when things weren't going well on the plantations, it had a direct effect. So she and her husband were unable to live in the way that they were accustomed to, and they had to move out of their London house. Poor things. And but a neighbour said, "Oh, you can use my house during the season," or whatever. Unfortunately for her, her husband then ends up having an affair with the neighbour's wife. It's because they're all living in close counters, and Lady Cadogan, who's been in a deep depression for years, suddenly livens up and runs off with the husband, who's also a reverend, who's just joined the church. And it really doesn't play out very well. The funniest bit about it, they elope to Abergavenny. And Lord Cadogan manages to track them down really easily because Lady Cadogan insisted on travelling with her pet chaffinches birds in a little bird cage. So everyone who saw them on the road spotted this bird cage. So then he gets sued, he sues him. Anyway, there's a whole court case. It's always good for a historian when there's a court case, because then you've got some good meaty evidence of people, attacking each other. It's always nice to get a bit of drama as well. But they end up, the other funny thing is they then manage to escape to France, this eloped couple, but they go over there during the Peace of Amiens, which is a brief pause in the Napoleonic Wars. But then Napoleon comes back and imprisons all the Brits in France for the foreseeable future. So they're stuck in Verdun until she dies, actually. Anyway, there are so many sort of crazy little stories like this in the book.
Yeah, there's multiple. There's so many that it's really hard to actually recall. Like, each chapter is absolutely jam-packed with more drama possibly than Bridgerton. Honestly, and these are real people. So I suppose my final question would be, or possibly my final question would be, what would you really like people to understand about these heiresses, or what would you like for people to take away from this particular book?
Well, I think again, that women are just as culpable in the story. That marriage could be a way in which this wealth comes into Britain and to different families that we might not always look for, and that we need to have our eyes open for the different ways in which families might profit from enslavement, and also just this sort of the infinite connections that you find once you start sort of pulling the thread of these stories. It just unravels the whole of what we thought we knew about British history.
Also, actually, sorry, I've got maybe one or two more.
Go ahead.
Were any of them directly connected to Liverpool or not?
Not very. I think there was one that I didn't end up focusing on, who lived at Leasowe Castle on the Wirral. I'm hoping to sort of write up some of the kind of women who were fell by the wayside and to put them on the heiresses.co.uk website. I suppose the sort of main link to Liverpool in the book is the brief bit at the end where I talk about my own family's connections to enslavement, and I sort of unearthed a couple of ancestors who were actually Liverpool merchants trafficking enslaved people. So that's in there at the end, but I want to sort of dig into that in more detail now that I've got this off my desk.
Okay, a further question if you've got time. What are your thoughts on reparations? Obviously, you're donating your proceeds to reparations. What other ways can people, show or do reparative justice who are connected to the likes of these heiresses?
I think there isn't like a kind of there's definitely not a consensus. It's a big there's definitely some how not to stories out there, but I think that I suppose what I would say is really important that it's not just about handing over a check and washing your hands of it and going away, because that doesn't solve the problem. There is no amount of money that would wash the crimes away and wash away the consequences. So I think it's important to focus on work and actions that can help combat the consequences we're still living with of racism and inequality, and the horrific divisive politics that we're living through right now. So I suppose, I would say this, but more like education and more telling these stories. I think anyone connected to it needs to be really open about the history and not try to hide it in any way. I think there's you could go further if your family has any archive or any kind of material that's not in the public domain, to make sure that that's open to researchers, but also sort of think about ways of talking about it to a broader public, you know, to inform the conversation, but most importantly to talk to people who are descendants of enslaved people, to talk to them about and build those relationships, and because it's about making peace with ourselves and within our society and righting the wrongs and the pain that we're living with. And I think that, yeah, that has to come through conversation and working together.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Excellent.